Good evening. Welcome to Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. On the programme tonight, Indian players are racially sledged once again in Sydney by spectators. The police this time get involved. This is a repeat incident, remember, and a huge problem now on this tour. In fact, it's ruined the spirit in which this tour has been played so far. The boorish behaviour of Aussie spectators is known. Can anything serious be done to those who abused our players for the second time this tour? In fact, it's happened in the past as well on previous tours. Now, there is evidence that the Australian Cricket Board is looking at this very seriously. In fact, they've said so. They insist that they will act on the evidence whenever it presents itself, or perhaps they already have enough. On this program, a little later on, we'll be joined by Tracy Holmes, the well-known Australian Broadcasting Corporation broadcaster, somebody very close to the world of sports in Australia, on her views on the racial assault on our players in Australia. But also coming up very soon, our panel to look at the racism encountered by our players. But first, this is what Ravi Ashwin had to say.
To point out something, I've been coming, this is my fourth tour to Australia, and Sydney, especially here, we've had a few experiences even in the past. And I think one or two times even the players have reacted and have got into trouble in the past. And that's not because of the player. It is actually because of the way the crowd has been speaking, especially the people on the lower tier of the stands. They have been quite nasty. They have been hurling abuses as well. But this is a time where they've actually gone one step higher and used racial abuses. And like we already mentioned, there was an official complaint that we lodged yesterday, and the umpires also mentioned that we must bring it to their notice as it happens on the field, and then they'll be able to take action. And it is definitely not acceptable in this day and age where we've come through, we've seen a lot, right? We evolved as a society, and sometimes I think this roots back to the upbringing and the way one sees. So this must be definitely dealt with iron fist, and we must make sure that it doesn't happen again. Personally, I think Adelaide and Melbourne wasn't as bad, but like I said, this has been a continual thing at Sydney. I've personally experienced it as well. They do tend to get nasty. I don't know why or for what reason, or they don't, unless and until it is dealt with, people don't really find the necessity to, look at it in a different way. In fact, I was quite surprised that some sections of the crowd continuously did it, and there were not mates around them who pulled them up for it. That was quite surprising as well. So it definitely had to be dealt with, and yes, disappointing is actually a very, very mild word, I must say.
Well, let's take a look at what Virat Kohli has actually tweeted about this incident. He was appalled by what happened. He said racial abuse is absolutely unacceptable. Having gone through many incidents of really pathetic things said on the boundary lines, this is the absolute peak of rowdy behaviour. It's sad to see this happen on the field. The incident, he said, needs to be looked at very, very seriously. Joining us, John Gloucester, the former Indian team physio, the Rajasthan Royals head physio and medical coordinator, Amrit Mathur, the ex-general manager of the cricket board, and Charu Sharma joins us as well. John, let me come to you first. You've been with the Indian team, you've travelled with them extensively. Have you personally come across instances of racial abuse targeting Indian players?
Yeah, look, I have heard from the crowd, absolutely, in many grounds around the world, not just in Australia, actually. And personally, I've also been at the end of some abuse myself. Often when we have to roam the boundary, you hear it out of the corner of your ear sometimes. And yeah, but I think we've got to a point now where we realise that it's not acceptable. I believe that there should be a name and shame, and there are people that roam the ground within the grounds in Australia now who are looking out for this stuff all the time. That needs to be policed a lot stronger, I believe. The fact that the players have done exactly the right thing. They brought it to the attention of the officials on the ground. The on-ground officials have then taken that to the match referee, and then beyond that to the governing bodies. So I think they've done exactly the right thing. But I do believe in this case that the police should be brought in. Those individuals can be identified, and they will be identified, and when they are, they're named and shamed. But just let me say that this is not representative of the majority of the Australian people. This is a small part of that, but that small part is bad enough, and that small part has to be eradicated at the earliest.
John, as a physio, you are part of the small team that looks after the wellness of cricketers. Now, there's obviously physical wellness, there's mental wellness as well. If you don't have mental wellness, you can't perform as a cricketer. End of story. We all know that to be sacrosanct. Do things like this really affect cricketers, or the instances that you've seen, has it really affected the cricketers you've been working with?
Absolutely, Vishnu. And I think the fact that they bring it to your attention means that it has it some way buried into their psyche a little bit detrimentally. And I think that's sad. And we're now focusing more and more on the mental health of players. And this is a very big component of the mental health, positive mental health aspect of players, and we need to address it. And so I totally agree that if this is something that is left unattended to, then the bigger effect on the individual may not be just in the performance on the field. It may be beyond the performance in their personal lives and beyond that as well, which just cannot happen. So yes, it's something we need to put our hand up and say, we've got to address this straight away. Let's not let it simmer anymore. And show the Indian board and show the Indian players that we are going to, exactly as Ravi said, meet this with an iron fist, and I believe exactly how this should be dealt with.
Yeah. Charu, it's sad because, when we talk about India and Australia and all the great cricket, there is also this legacy of racial abuse and criticism having come into play. There was the infamous incident between Andrew Simons and Harbhajan Singh many years back that ultimately went into adjudication. There was a judge from New Zealand who ruled in favor of Harbhajan. But the point is that, it's messed up a tour in the past, created all the wrong situations. And now, you have this again, this bugbear making itself evident once again. And it's sad because the spirit with which Charu, the players have played this tour has been exemplary. I haven't seen a better tour in that sense.
Well, yes, Vishnu. I think the spirit was all about the gratitude that there is cricket to be played in this strange time of this whole COVID mess. So that gratitude has now turned into just, once again, a similar situation. I'll take that several steps forward. It's not just India, Australia, Vishnu. It's around the world. And not just in the world of sport, but in every arena. So this is a real, visible problem. The difference now is that people are standing up. People are standing up in the US or perhaps in India when they go to Australia, anywhere and everywhere, and the media is picking it up. So there's a wonderful movement to try and eradicate this. But, ultimately, we're all individuals, Vishnu. So if one was to move forward and say, how can this be eradicated? It's very, very difficult. Perhaps what can happen is what Cricket Australia is doing is good in that they're identifying people, trying to, punish, eject. But I do think that the problem can be perhaps the solution can be fast-tracked by a wider set of people, sadly and unfortunately, paying the penalty. So perhaps you haven't gotten to that in your discussion about how to eradicate it, but if a wider set of people, if in the past, for instance, grounds have been banned, you're talking about a bit of a racial slur here, but bottles have been thrown, rocks have been thrown, and those grounds have been banned. And, matches between nations can be banned. So if Indian cricket will now no longer be played in Australia because of this incident, then we're talking about fast-tracking a solution to the problem. Otherwise, it exists in every part of the world, Vishnu. And yeah, we can isolate it, we can punish a few, but it's just something that is very deep set. And I'm not being a pessimist here. Perhaps it'll take, 10, 20, 30 years to at least find solutions to eradicate it. But it's a real problem. And I'm glad that players, as Stan Jones said the right thing, that the right things were put into motion and the right action has been taken so far. But of course, we need to do a lot more.
Yeah. Mr. Mathur, it's not just in Australia. And this is something that's traveled with the world of cricket for a very long time. You do remember, of course, the most infamous incident perhaps was the word grovelling, which was used by an England captain in referring to the West Indies in the late 70s that fired up Michael Holding and a bunch of people on a tour which was defined by race relations. The West Indian players have been targeted even in India when they've come in the past. Our own spectators are awful sometimes in referring to people, by skin color and the like. My question is this: it's a problem around the world, isn't it?
It is. And coming to today's incident, I agree with what John said and what Charu said about the players having done the right thing. Siraj was the victim of this racial abuse. He complained. I think after that, the BCCI did the right thing, the CA did the right thing. They condemned the incident. They apologized to the Indian team. There's an investigation going on by Cricket Australia, where even the New South Wales police is involved. And the offensive spectators were ejected. But I think you have to be a bit practical in this. There are protocols, there are rules, there are local laws which prevent or try to prevent racial abuse, but you have to be practical. If a random guy comes into a stadium and shoots his mouth off, you can't really control it. You can penalize him, you can evict him, you can fine him, you can ban him, but you can't control it. And as you said, this is not something just specific to Australia. Bad incidents have happened in other countries. In New Zealand, with Jofra Archer was the recipient of similar abuse. There are incidents in India and elsewhere. I think what you need to do is look at the entire issue of racial abuse and discrimination at different levels. One is of a spectator, like what happened today. But there are also instances where the players have a go at each other.
Yeah.
And not only players having a go at the opposition, there have been instances where the players have had a go at a colleague. For instance, what Darren Sammy complained in the IPL about how his colleagues in the IPL franchise acted in a manner which was not really proper. At an even higher level, there are also instances of institutionalized racism.
Yeah.
In England, there's an umpire, John Holder, who's thinking of suing the ECB for discrimination. There's a Pakistani origin player, Azim Rafiq, who's actually gone to court against Yorkshire for institutionalized discrimination. You'll also remember that certain abusive behavior was also directed towards Pujara at Yorkshire, where he was, like everybody else, just called Steve. So there are instances of racial discrimination where a fan or a spectator comes in and says something wrong. But I think what is more worrying is when it is institutionalized, or when the players who ought to know better, who have also signed up to a policy of anti-discrimination and anti-racism, when they breach the protocols. I think that's more serious.
No, I agree completely. John, when we started off this interview, you said something interesting. You said that things were said to you as well. That's a fact. People don't discriminate on skin color. They just see somebody and they just get after them. And that's what happened to you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, so you're right. But yeah, I think there's been some really interesting points raised about, the depth of this problem and how we have to go about solving the problem, not just at an individual level, but perhaps at an association level and at a board level. But there's this one good thing that's come out of this, is that every time this happens, there's a greater awareness. And the more we're aware of it, the more we now have strategies to sort of to voice those concerns around this. So I think the awareness is the one good thing that's come out of this, and I'm really happy to see that the process was followed with the players and the administrators. And let's hope that that there's a greater shift going forward for the positive, and we look forward to some better cricket and some better crowd behaviours in the fourth test.
Charu, is there a real concern that this is something which might affect players and their performance on tour in Australia right now?
Well, the players, I think, just a personal opinion, are more hardy, Vishnu. I mean, I'm not suggesting that they face it every day and that they're used to it. So I just think that, ultimately it's the white line fever. When you're inside that white line, the boundary line or the arena for any sport, you tend to be far, far more focused than otherwise. So I don't think it's going to, for the moment, affect the players hugely. Of course, consistently, if this is done and not, if a solution is not found, then it does tend to affect people. But, the right steps are being taken. That's very important. I'll just repeat what I said earlier. Perhaps I'll put it differently. I think that no amount of policing can take care of individuals who, perhaps under the influence, say stuff that they, maybe mean or maybe think they can get away with. But it's up to people around them, the spectators around them. Each one of us has to be a policeman to say, well, for heaven's sake, what are you saying? Shut them up. So unless that attitude is prevalent, I think it's very difficult to try and eradicate this, because you can't police crime. I mean, it's got to come from people around you. So maybe that extra awareness that, listen, all of us are going to be in trouble. The match will not be held in Sydney again for the next 5 years, or whatever collective punishment is meted out. I think that will be far more effective. So for the moment, the right things are being done, but a lot more needs to be done consistently across the world of sport, and perhaps other worlds as well, to make sure that a wider set of people are, and of course this is unfortunate, are put into a spot where they kind of really will ensure that this doesn't happen around them at least. And the more people that try and ensure that it doesn't happen around them, the less the incidences in the future.
Mr. Mathur, last word to you. The fact that the ICC has gotten involved, they've issued statements. Cricket Australia absolutely keen to deal with this as forcefully as possible. These are all good signs that we can expect something serious by way of a resolution.
Listen, this is according to the set protocols of anti-discrimination and anti-racism. Every time there's an incident, the host cricket board investigates. ICC also assists in the inquiry. And I think in the past in New Zealand, there have been instances where there has been action against the people who've been found guilty of such behavior. But I agree that, it's a problem which can't really be solved just by legislation or rules. I think awareness is an issue. And as John said, it's good that this incident, after it happened, has been condemned by everybody associated with cricket. Maybe what Charu says also has merit, that maybe there should be stricter measures against maybe the staging association, the city which organizes the game, maybe not grant them a match in the future. So I think a combination of awareness, strong penal action, I think is a solution in terms of really curbing this menace.
Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us. We have a very special guest with us now, Tracy Holmes, the ABC broadcaster, somebody very close to the world of sport in Australia and somebody who's obviously observed all of this very, very closely, what's taking place. I spoke to her a little while earlier today. Here's what she said. Unfortunate that a series that's been played with the right spirit, the players all know each other so well, that something like this would have to happen. Realistically, do you think action can be taken against those who are behind this?
Yes, look, thank you so much for having me, first of all, and I'm sorry that he's under these sorts of circumstances and that this is the discussion that we're having. But I think if people come forward with any evidence that they have, whether that be filming it on their own cameras, people who had been taking photos, I know there was a photographer at the time who had been taking note of what was going on in that particular area of the crowd. If these sorts of witnesses come forward and evidence can be gathered, I think there's going to be very serious repercussions for those involved in this alleged racist behaviour. As you mentioned, there has been a very distinct and forthright announcement from Cricket Australia saying they will not tolerate this. The same sort of message has been sent out from Venues New South Wales, which manages the SCG, and they have said that anyone found guilty of racism will be banned from the SCG, and not only the SCG, but any other venue that comes under their suite of venues that they look after.
Now, Ashwin just a little while back said that it's the SCG where the Indian cricket team believes that there are problems. There may have been remarks made elsewhere, but it's the SCG crowd, which some parts of which appear to be doing this. I don't know if that's necessarily accurate because, racists can be anywhere. But is there a problem in the SCG, something with the way the crowd behaves, or is there a trigger? Or I don't understand. I mean, do you have any thoughts on this? Why the SCG?
Look, I would like to think that it is not particular to the SCG. I would like to think that it's not particular to any venue in Australia, and that this is something that we hope we are weeding out of our own society and out of our own culture. I'm in no way going to make any excuses for any racist behaviour anywhere. It's unfortunate that it seems to happen at the SCG far too frequently when it comes to particularly, the touring Indian team, which most people in this country and most people in Sydney, I know, look forward to these test matches because it is such great competition. And this series has been played in the spirit that I think the Australian captain, Justin Langer, was saying he was hoping that this series would be played in a really very contestable, very great contest, but in a really wonderful way that, that there is this friendship and this community of cricket that traverses all sorts of boundaries. And unfortunately, this incident today has ruined that for so many. But I hope it doesn't ruin the memories of this current tour and the memories that your players will take back home with them, because it's certainly not the impression that I get in Sydney, in a majority of places, sure, or in any particular cricket fraternity. This is not what we want to see, and it is not what most people are thinking, believing, or behaving.
And Tracy, it's unfortunate that this seems to have cropped up now. India and Australia have had this terrible experience a few years back. There was that entire Monkey Gate episode. Harbhajan Singh was involved. Andrew Simons was involved. There was this huge animosity, different circumstances between the Indian and Australian teams. There was an adjudicator, a judge from New Zealand. That was eventually sorted out. But again, different circumstances, the issue of racism came up, and here we see racism once again. It is unfortunate that this has come up in our histories, our shared history of cricket once again, isn't it?
It certainly is, and you would hope that it doesn't, and you would hope that this is the end to it. I'm guessing that it probably won't be. I'm guessing that it will probably happen again. And all you can keep doing, and I admire the conversations that you have been having. I know there have been some very public discussions here in Australia as well, completely condemning that sort of behaviour. And even those sorts of very public discussions on coming down on racist abuse and the fact that it should not exist in 2021, particularly not in a sporting contest in a country that loves sport and loves welcoming teams that are as talented as the one that you give us that comes to play here. But these discussions are being had more publicly. People are wrestling with them more in Australia, which is a good thing, because you hope that by calling it out and by discussing these things in public, that we do actually improve, that the situation is moving forward, not backwards, and not even stagnating. We want it to move forward, but obviously it is just not fast enough.
Tracy, I couldn't agree more, but there is a history, and it's unfortunate, to this great game and racism. It's happened against the West Indies in England in the late 70s. There have been allegations made by West Indian players, even in India, of them having been targeted racially. This is now taking place in Australia. This has been a problem for this great sport, hasn't it? Around the world, not just Australia.
That's true, and racism is not unique to Australia. As you know, I've lived in several countries as well, and I know that there is racism everywhere. The way we overcome racism is to address it, is to call it out, is to have these discussions. And also, I'd really like to make this point, because I would hate people to think that it's only when the Indian team comes to Australia that this issue is raised, in a very ugly and very high-profile way. This situation of racism, and I said before, and I truly believe this, that the situation is improving in Australia, but we have it here amongst our own. We have it here with our Indigenous population and some of our very great athletes in particular football codes like the AFL, which is Australia's domestic football code, Aussie rules. And there have been shocking allegations of racism, not just allegations, but racist behaviour has been found to happen, and right up until now. But clubs are addressing it, sports are addressing it, societies are addressing it, and we hope that as that kind of pressure is maintained, that we get forward on this. It's an education process. I have no idea why it takes so long to be able to eradicate it, and we probably never truly will. But we need to keep on top of it, and I truly believe that the situation is getting better. It must get better, and it does get better when we have the courage of athletes and players, and we hope that there are courageous people in the crowds that will also call out this sort of behaviour and say it's just not acceptable anymore.
And I think it's so important that we have these forthright conversations to try and sort out a problem that exists in so many parts of the world. It is unacceptable in any situation, certainly unacceptable in sport as well. I'd like to thank you, Tracy Holmes, very much for joining us and sharing your views. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for having me.